Recently, there have been some new big releases for both the Blood Angels and for Kill Team, and I thought what better way to celebrate both than to build a Blood Angels Kill Team, but using neither of these two boxes. Instead, I'll be using some of these Crimson Lord bits from Great-Eyed Studio, which will be launched via a My Mini Factory Frontiers campaign. There are over 300 bits which work incredibly well for turning your regular old Space Marines into Blood Angels. Now, I'll be talking more about the campaign later on, but first, let's build a kill team. I based my Blood Angels kill team around the rules for Strike Force Justian. Now, there is no guarantee that this team will still be supported in the new rules refresh for Kill Team, but as it's a mixed team, I thought it'd be the most interesting to build. So, I began the team with Tybiel, who I based on Sergeant Marius. I started out with a regular intercessor and selected the bolter that is being reloaded for his right arm. I wanted to use a pointing right arm, so needed to add a mag to the bolter being held at rest. This was pretty straightforward to achieve though. I removed the mag from the bolt rifle piece, cleaned it up and glued it to the bolter before assembling both the arms. To help bulk out Tybiel, I then also removed the scope from the bolt rifle piece before gluing it to the belt along with a few intercessor pouches. This was further expanded on with a purity seal and a regular intercessor right shoulder pad. Now, maybe you're thinking this guy doesn't look like a Blood Angel, and you'd be right, a little impatient but still right. My fix for this saw me dipping into the 3D printed parts from Great-Eye's Crimson Lord's range. I started out with a few extra detail parts like a vial adorned necklace and a blood drop styled reliquary. Both of these were attached via superglue rather than the usual plastic glue. In addition to these, I also attached a suitably ornate resin shoulder pad. There were still a few extra details to add though, but these wouldn't be glued to the model just yet. These included a resin head and a backpack, which I kept separate to make painting them easier. To hold these parts though, I first drilled a 1mm hole into a point that would be hidden once assembled. Into the hole, I then superglued a length of 1mm steel wire, which would act as a holder. But the Great-Eyed parts didn't stop there. There are also these base toppers that create an instant scenic base. This was superglued to a 32mm base, but I didn't attach Tybiel just yet. Instead, he was glued to a separate temporary base with a small amount of superglue that could easily be broken off later on. For my second kill team member, Bardala, I wanted to make use of some of the Crimson Lord's Death Company parts. It didn't make much sense to me though to have a Black Rage afflicted kill team member, so I instead looked to the lore, with there being examples of Blood Angel successors painting their armor black as a tribute to the fallen of the Death Company. In my headcanon, I imagined Bardala's biological brother falling to the Black Rage, and him bearing his armor to remember him. Bardala is also based on the auto bolt rifle wielding Vignes, so to give the model a little more dynamism, I attached an auto bolt rifle to an assault intercessor torso instead. For the right shoulder pad, I took inspiration from a piece of Blood Angel's artwork and drilled 3 1mm holes into the pad before gluing some short lengths of 1mm plastic rod into each. Onto one of these, I attached a citadel skull that had been cut down and drilled through with another 1mm hole. To the others, I created some pennants by removing the wax seals from a couple of purity seals. Through the tops of each of these, I very carefully drilled a 1mm hole before hooking it over the plastic rod. The right shoulder pad was much more straightforward though, and saw me attaching one of the resin Death Company marked shoulder pads. To give the power pack a slightly more ornate appearance, I used my knife and file to flatten out the center plate before supergluing a resin fanged skull. These are designed more for vehicle use, but they still work well for these backpacks. I also glued a topper to a base and attached Bardala to a temporary one. I did this for all of the team members, so rather than repeating it each time, you can just assume that I did this step for each one. Next up, I had Galani, who I base on the Grenadier Vignes from the original Kill Team. He started out as a regular intercessor torso and legs, which I attached a one-handed bolt rifle to, along with a grenade arm taken from the assault intercessor kit. To give Galani a little extra protection from his own grenades, I decided to attach an assault intercessor shoulder pad with the extended trim to his right arm, along with a resin pad to his left. Again, to bulk up Galani's armor a little, I took an intercessor tilt shield, trimmed down the back and glued it to his left thigh. but he can hardly be called a grenadier without more than one grenade, so I attached a couple of grenade strips taken from the Phobos kits like the Reavers and the Infiltrators. These were accompanied by some resin and some more plastic pouches. Galani was then finished off with a few purity seals and the usual pinning and basing steps. Next up was my version of Decian the Assault Intercessor, who I'd renamed to Castivar. For him, I started out with a regular Assault Intercessor chainsword arm and carefully clipped away the hand and the chainsword. The wrist was then trimmed back until I was left with a flat surface in which to attach a Crimson Lord chainsword to. With this done, the chainsword and a pistol was glued to a regular Intercessor torso, which left me with a much more defensive looking stance than if I'd used an Assault Intercessor torso instead. As a slight nod to the 40k 2nd edition box set art, I decided to attach an Orc Skull trophy to Castivar's backpack. This was done in the same way as I tackled Bardala's shoulder pad, starting with a 1mm hole, attaching some rod and then attaching an Orc Skull, which I'd also drilled a hole through. For his shoulder pads, I decided to mix up his right shoulder pad somewhat and give him more of a lithe look by gluing a cut down Phobos shoulder pad over his right arm. To further build up the Blood Angels theming, a resin tilt shield was attached to build up the close combat specialization, along with a purity seal, some pouches, and finally a Crimson Lord tabard. For his head, I selected this Spartan-esque resin helmet before attaching his base and miniature holders. Next up was Vestra and my continued reshuffling of torso types. Here I approached the Eliminator, formerly known as Flavian, with a Reaver torso and legs, which also meant that I didn't need to break into a fresh box of Eliminators that I was saving for my Raptors army. To attach a spare bolt rifle, I took a spare Reaver left arm, removed the tab at the wrist, and attached the bolt rifle being held with just the left hand. To give the impression of Vesta being mid-reload, I took another Eliminator arm. This one is perfect as it's reaching for a pouch, but I did need to first clip and scrape away the remnants of the cloak from the shoulder pad. After making a few adjustments and trims, the arm was attached so that it reached towards the thigh pouches. Without the cloak getting in the way, I was free to attach a pistol holster along with Crimson Lord Reliquary. I then continued with the Grey Tide parts by then attaching one of the Phobos specific left shoulder pads as well. Vesta was then finished off with a Marksman Honours on his rifle along with some Purity Seals to his shoulder pad. Finally, he was given a Phobos head along with a 40mm base topper to reflect his Eliminator role. When it came to the Heavy Intercessor, who I'd renamed Oras, my work here was fairly straightforward. I began by attaching the Heavy Bolter arms. While I used the Heavy Bolter as a guide, I decided to not to attach the bolter just yet. Instead, I opted to remove the cabling. This wasn't for any aesthetic reasons though, and was just to make attaching the bolter easier later on. With the arms in place, I attached a resin, Gravis-scaled shoulder pad, and an iron halo. If you've played the Space Marine 2 multiplayer, you'll understand why. Oras was then finished off with some pouches to his waist and one to his chest. His codpiece was then trimmed down to make room for another tabard. Again, his head was also a Crimson Lord's one, with me settling on this masked head to continue the theme of heavier armor. And finally, we have my captain, Lorenzo. Rather than basing him on a captain model, I instead used the multi-part lieutenant model as my starting point. While assembling the legs and torso, before I attached the right leg plate, I first shaved away the sculpted details. This, once I'd attached to the leg, gave me the space to add these ornate looking resin armor plates, which really helped to make Lorenzo stand out further as a captain. I then proceeded to pile on the Crimson Lord parts. The first of these was a tabard, which did need some adjustment to fit against the right thigh before it could be glued. From here, I recreated the original Justian's loadout by attaching a Power Fist right arm and a plasma pistol wielding left arm. His right shoulder pad was also a resin one, but his left was a regular plastic pad. I also tried to further sanguinify his armor by attaching a small blood drop amulet to the chest Imperialis, marking the first time I've actually added to this rather than just shaving it away. Lorenzo's base was approached a little differently though. The base lieutenant model features your typical tactical rock, so I opted to add this with a few resin basing details rather than a full topper. I also planned on giving Lorenzo a cape, but as you could probably have guessed by now, I kept this separate too. After pinning the pack, the head and the cape, I was then able to move on to the painting. But before we do, let me first tell you a little more about the Crimson Lord campaign and this video's sponsor. Great Tide Studios are launching their campaign on the 25th of September through My Mini Factory's Frontiers. Now the parts I've used in this build are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's available. There are over 300 unique parts ranging from the shoulder pads, heads and trinkets all the way up to full weapons, wing jump packs and even dreadnought armor. These are all available in various packs so that you can pick up the exact parts you're looking for, and there are also a few milestone unlocks which will see more parts being added to the range. Plus, if you're a fan of Grey Tide's other bits ranges such as their Primal Hounds, Eternal Pilgrims and Cursed Company, these will also be available as discounted add-ons during the campaign. All of these parts will be available as both pre-supported STLs that you can print yourself at home, or as physical components like the ones I've used in this video. I'll include some links to the campaign down in the description and as a pinned comment, and if you sign up before the 25th, you can download a free sample of bits and be notified of the campaign's launch. But that's not all. Grey Tide has also given me the code PETEXGTS24, which will give you 25% off any product in Grey Tide Studios' My Mini Factory store. So check out my links and help fund this awesome range of bits. Now, let's continue working on the kill team and get them painted up. When it came to priming the kill team, I was planning on using a colour primer, such as the Colourforge's Sanguine Red, but I'd ran out. So I instead settled on using a black airbrush primer followed by a layer of Sanguine Scarlet from the Tooth and Coat range. This gave me a great starting point for the Blood Angel's red armour. I did however keep the bases as their black primer though. To help bring out the armour detailing, I decided to pick out a few of the edges of the armour with a dry brush of Flaming Forge Orange. To prep my dry brush, I lightly dampened the brush and laid out a thin line onto my texture palette. A small amount of the paint was added to the brush before I worked the paint through the bristles. From here, I could lightly drag the brush across the armour so the paint accumulated onto just the edges. This has a similar effect to an edge highlight, but is generally a much faster method of application. After the dry brush, the orange had slightly dulled the intensity of the red, so I decided to lightly spray a coat of Ball Red contrast paint over the armour. I didn't need to use my airbrush for this. I could have instead diluted it with some contrast medium and applied it with a regular brush. As this dried, it helped to bring back the intensity of the red, whilst also blending the Flaming Forge Orange back into the Sanguine Scarlet. With the red armour complete, I could next begin to work on the many gold detailing spread across the kill team. These were all hit with a base coat of Dragon's Gold, which was slightly diluted with a little water and applied in a couple of layers. Over the red base coat, this left me with a rich, warm gold. To help darken down the recesses of the gold details, I took some Cygor Brown contrast paint and diluted it with some airbrush thinner. This kept the strength of the paint but helped to reduce its viscosity. As I applied it, the thinner mixture pulled into the recesses where it helped to create the effect of shadows. For some of the heads, notably the eliminators and the heavy intercessors, I base coated their masks with some Witching Hour blue. While Oras should have technically been red, I wanted to reflect his heavy bolter and so marked him as fire support. The blue was then washed with some Oblivion black, and the edges were carefully picked out with some thin lines of Leviathan Blue. Continuing with the helmets, I next tackled the close support yellow of Castavar's helmet and began with a base coat of Dark Sun Yellow. Washed it with some Flesh Wash, and then highlighted its edges with some Craven Yellow. At this point, I returned to the metallic areas and painted any silver metallic or steel details with a base coat of Surcoat Silver, which were then washed with some Oblivion Black. For all of the weapon stocks, the segments between the armor plate and any pipes, I applied a base coat of Doomdeath Black, before highlighting them with some Dungeon Stone Grey. When it came to tackling all the various pouches, straps, skulls and pieces of parchment, I base coated everything in the same way using some Ancient Forest. However, after the base coats, I approached these areas differently. The leather details were all washed with Battle Mud Wash, which gave them a darker tone. Darker than the remaining areas, which were instead washed with some Archaic Sepia. This gave them a slightly more yellowish hue, which would act as a good starting point for the appearance of bone and paper. Then, to highlight the pouches, I used some thin lines of Temple Stone. whereas the skulls and paper were instead highlighted with Skeleton Legion. Next up, I lumped all the gemstones, lenses and wax seals together and base coated them all with some sword hilt Burgundy. These were then highlighted with some of the lighter, glistening gums. For the lenses and gems though, I only highlighted the bottom right of each circle or blood drop. These lenses and gems were then completed with a small dot in their upper left segment. The combination of these two steps helped to create the effect of a translucent material. With all the purple details complete, I could start to work on the skin. Faces often draw your attention the most, so it usually pays to spend a little more time on these sorts of details. I began my process with a base coat of Barbarian Brawn. The facial features were then picked out with some Dwarven Skin. The paint was thinned with a little water before being applied in a couple of layers to help smooth out the gradients. Finally, the most prominent details were picked out with some small dots of Elven Skin. Continuing with the faces, I then painted the eyes. Now this can be quite daunting and it is an optional step, but if you want to paint them, start out by painting the whole eye with some white star. A fine point on your brush is extremely important for both of these steps. The pupil was then added with some Black Legion. I prefer to use a contrast paint for this, mainly because the paint is a little thinner and transfers off the brush much more easily. To create the iconic blonde hair of the Blood Angels, I first started out with a couple of thin layers of Cerberus Brown. Washed them with some Archaic Sepia, before picking out the individual clumps and strands of hair with a mixture of Cerberus Brown and White Star. At this point, the Marines themselves were complete and I could turn my attention to the bases. To create a grey stone effect across them, I broke up my dry brush once again and hit everything with some Scorched Earth. Over this base colour, I then dry brushed the bases again with some Dungeon Stone Grey. Leaving some of the Scorched Earth still visible in the recesses helped to create the appearance of dirt. Finally, the edges of the rocks were picked out with a light dry brush of Carcharadon Grey, which was applied in much the same way as the earlier Flaming Forge Orange. To paint all of the various remaining details across the base, such as the metal, thorns, flowers and skulls, I simply repeated the same steps that I'd used to paint their similar details on the Marines themselves. When it came to Lorenzo's base though, I had to fill in the gaps between the base's details, and I achieved this with some of AK Interactive's Dark Earth texture paste. This was carefully laid out across the base where I paid close attention to keep a space clear for Lorenzo's left foot. After allowing it to dry, the texture paste was then washed with some Oblivion black to help enhance that texture. Another optional step were the decals. I kept these simple and just tackled the right shoulder pads, but first, the pads were given a coat of gloss varnish. This would not only protect the existing paint, but also create a better surface to apply the decal to. From here, I cut out a few company markings from a transfer sheet before soaking them in some water until they lifted from their backing paper. Once they were ready, I carefully teased the transfers away from the backing paper and into place with a damp brush. I gave them some time to dry before then coating them with a product called Microsol. This is a mild solvent that softens out the decal and allows it to better sit across the curved surface. It did need a couple of coats to sit properly, but if you're following this yourself, just make sure you allow it to fully dry between applications. With the decals in place, I then set about removing all the pins and removing the paint from the contact points before finally gluing everything together. With the models assembled, I gave everything a coat of matte varnish. This not only locked in the decals and protected my paintwork, but also helped to reduce some of the glossiness of the earlier washes. Finally, I wanted to add a little extra detail to the bases, something that would contrast nicely against the red of the armor: snow. This was created by mixing up a few products from AK Interactive. Roughly even amounts of snow sprinkles, snow micro balloons, and clear water were mixed together to create a paste. The sprinkles creates the cloudy effect, the micro balloons add texture, and the clear water helps to create a more translucent finish without losing the viscosity. This mixture was applied in small amounts across the base in small piles. I didn't want to cover everything with snow, I simply wanted to add to the existing details rather than covering them over. And with that, I was left with this. And here we have the completed Blood Angels kill team, based on Strikeforce Justian. Now, while there is no guarantee that this will remain legal in a rules sense, it was still a great fun to build. Having the Crimson Lord parts takes care of the Blood Angels theming, allowing me to focus more on creating unique individuals. I also tried my best to give each member of the squad an appearance that better defined their role, something that was particularly important around the 3 bolter-armed intercessors. Now, regardless of if you plan on building a kill team or even some Blood Angels, I hope that you were able to pick up something for your own projects. But if you would like to recreate these models, then you can find all the parts and paints that I used to build it linked in the description below. And don't forget to check out the Crimson Lord campaign over on my mini factory if you'd like to get your hands on some of these excellent parts. But before I go, I just want to give my thanks to my Patreon supporters and channel members who help to keep this channel going. Especially my Pouch of Dead Animal Bits and above supporters, who are Axel Jonsson, Berserker, Bits of Wargaming, Chris Reynolds, Daniel Dowling, Gabe Benavidez, Immaterial Creations, Maciej Savitsky, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Nima, Pale Juice, Ryan Little, Splinkus, Swedsman, Tim, Tom A. Smith, and War Novice. And my Sergeant level channel members, who are Alex Wern, Omnitom, Kutch Gato, S.O., Phoenix's Den, Lloyd Davis, Trooper Geo, David, John Gibbs, The Sire Acquired, Nerdington Bates, Mark Taylor, Will Tussler, and Philip Hoyer. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.